Hi, I am Sabina Simonson, Outreach Services and Volunteer Coordinator for the Talbot County Free Library, and you are watching the Talbot County Free Library presents Holland Island, Lost Atlantis of the Chesapeake. I must admit, I kind of like the title. Here to speak about this is Ann Foley. She began her writing career from Cabin John, Maryland, freelancing for local and national periodicals. In 1999, years after locating to Elliott Island, she published her first book, co-written with her neighbor, Freddie Waller, Elliott's Island, The Land That Time Forgot. Several other books followed. Her most recent work, Holland Island, Lost Atlantis of the Chesapeake, chronicles life in what was a thriving, close-knit community in Lower Dorchester County. She owes much to photos and articles collected over many years by P. Smith Root. This is the 100th anniversary of the community's dissolution when families dismantled their houses and sailed them to the mainland. The reassembled houses stand today from Somerset to Talbot counties, so scattered that it was said they sailed whichever way the wind was blowing. And here to tell more of their story, please give a warm Talbot County welcome to Ann Foley. What do you think if we set the mood tonight with a little music?
Oh, that'd be wonderful.
It so happens that we have Chris Cook here today, the gentleman in the middle, who wrote a song about Holland Island. And he's here with his friends, Terry Price and Chef Oliver. Please, entertain us.
This is a ballad of Holland Island, and it centers on one of the main characters, the latter history of the island, which is Mr. Price, or White, excuse me. And you'll hear more about him later from this poem. Here's our tale. Story so strange, it's a bit disarranged. In fact, it could be a child's fable. It's a story of an island in the Chesapeake Bay, and an old man who did all he was able. This island was formed many moons ago, back when the earth was quite cold. It harbored a town, watermen did abound, growing up strong and bold. Holland Island was sinking low, sinking and washing away. Old man White fought day and night. God had a plan to be getting his way. Yeah, one by one, watermen were gone, retreating back to the mainland. There those that did stay soon washed away, saving but the one house and a one man. Yes, full Holland Island was sinking low, sinking and washing away. Old man White fought day and night. God had a plan to be getting his way. But it happened one fall, and geese come to call. The storm rolled in dark and mean. Those waves, they stood tall as they battered it all. Defeated that lone house did lean. Yes, poor Holland Island was sinking low, sinking and washing away. Old man White fought day and night. God had a plan, and he's hell-bent on getting his way. and white, what the fight of his life, finally being beat by the seasons. But he'd taken a stand, and he fought for his land, in the end giving in for good reason. This poor Holland Island was sinking low, sinking and washing away. Old and white fought day and night. God had a plan which he shared with the man, saying, what you've done is okay. That island, she belongs to the bay. Yes, that island, she belongs to the bay. You have to talk to Ann Foley. She's our
Ladies and gentlemen, Ann Foley.
Good evening. I really enjoyed that. Such a treat to be here and meet you all. This rendering of Holland Island, it was Holland's Island always in the old days, and the artist who happened to be my niece that designed the book, she took this handwriting from one of the teachers that was out there on the island that I'm sure had an old straight pen that we dipped in the inkwell, and this was her handwriting duplicated, but we had to take the S off because modern days they don't put the S on the islands, except St. Michael's kept their S. I don't know how they managed that. But, the rest of us, like on Elliot's Island, we lost our S. The Holland Island is at the very tip of Dorchester County, and it's, you'll see on the map, this is 1877, the Highlands Island. There's nothing to the west of it. At the east of it is it's Tangier Sound. It looks like it says Holland Straits, but it's Tangier Sound, I would say, to the east of it, and that's where the really rich, easily accessible oyster beds were. So this is the cover of the book, and I wish I could explain who those people are and what they're doing out in the bay in their Sunday best, but I like to think it's could be the wedding party of Fulton Evans. He was engaged to Maggie Forrest, and he was in Chrisfield and picked up a marriage license, and when the day came, the preacher on the island looked at it and said, you know, I'm sorry, I can't marry you. Because we're in Dorchester County, and this is Somerset County license. So they all got in the boat and sailed a couple miles to South Marsh Island and got married on Johnson Point. But the way these, there were 3 counties, Somerset, Dorchester, and Wycomico came together right there. And the state line, it wasn't far north of the Virginia state line, which really complicated the workings of the oyster beds. But you can see, this is from the 1700s. This plat is a Long Island is to the west, and quite a large island, but it had disappeared by the time that 1877 map was made. And, you know, aerosol cans and auto emissions weren't an issue at the time, so what's really eating these islands is basically erosion, much more so than global warming, which I'm sure is an issue too, and land subsidence, but erosion is the big culprit. So back in the day, this is Joshua Thomas, the preacher, speaking to the British troops that were settled on the islands, and these wars that kept recurring every generation or so. Back when the bay was the main route of transportation, they were in the front lines of every war that came along. But he had brought Methodism to the island around the time of the Revolution. He was mainly unschooled preacher that had his autobiography ghost written pretty much, but he's the only one that left a record that I know of that gives you an island-eye view of how it was out there to have the world's most fearsome navy sail up to your doorstep and start telling people they have to get out, they need your house, and they built barracks out there and fortified the north shore of Holland's Island. And this Admiral Cockburn was, his name lived in infamy for another century after they defeated the British. But they said the war cry of the British troops was beauty and booty, and they terrorized every waterfront settlement around the bay. And our president, James Madison, he was a little cocky too, I think, as he said, he was quoted as saying, "It cannot be expected that I can defend every man's turnip patch." There was no federal navy, and the states were supposed to fend for themselves, and they weren't able either, so everybody was pretty much at the mercy of the British. And the British had these little islands, Tangier or Holland's Island, they had hundreds and hundreds of mouths to feed with all the Navy and the Marines that they sailed in, and then the enslaved people didn't know. Some of them escaped to the islands to have freedom under the British, and others were kidnapped when the raiding parties went around seeking provisions for the troops, looting all the waterfront communities. The next war was the Civil War. They were patrolled by the Potomac Flotilla out of the Navy Yard in Washington. And they were right at the intersection of the Confederacy and the Union. And they had a bit of a reputation on Holland's Island for doing some smuggling. There was a main route for smugglers. You could get a $25 gold piece for taking sympathizers from Maryland to the Confederacy to enlist. So it was quite tempting. And after that came the Oyster Wars, which were real shooting wars there. This was Commander Thomas, not Thomas, his name will come to me. He had the steamer McLean, which was, he fortified that. It was armored, the pilot house was armored, and he had a rack of Winchester rifles, and he had a howitzer mounted on it. And he was out after the oyster pirates. After the Civil War, the oysters had become a really valuable crop. The watermen couldn't work outside of their home county, much less their home state, but being nearby, the Virginia dredgers would come up and raid the oyster rocks, and Tangier Sound was a prime target for the Somerset County watermen as well as the local man. And this was a picture of a canoe, the hand tongers offloading onto a boat. And there were a lot of large boats harbored on Holland's Island. They really, the gold rush when it started, they really prospered, and a lot of people moved on to the island then. The local watermen, they had a better reputation than these Baltimore dredge boats. They were run mostly owned by packers or businessmen. They were saloon keepers and brothel owners, and they had agents to supply their crewmen. Said it was $2 a head, drunk or sober, for a crewman. But the dredge boat captains on Holland's Island, they were family-owned boats and family crews that took care of the local boats on Holland's Island. So they had a much better reputation. They had scientists from Johns Hopkins was studying the oyster industry. He called the dredgers unscrupulous and depraved, and the hand tongers, he said, they were illiterate and improvident. Their captains from Baltimore, they were just hired guns, and they would take whatever they could find, however they could get it. But the island watermen were much more respected. And this is a group gathered at the fence on a work day. They would go out when the season started in October, and if the harvest wasn't good or it had been looted too badly in Tangier Sound, they would have to go up to Cambridge, work the chop tank, because they had to stay in their county, so it took a good wind to get them all the way to the northern extreme of Dorchester County. But these guys, they cleaned up good. They were, this is Henry Duncan. I don't know if there's any Duncans maybe here. They settled on Tillman's Island and in Oxford, so there's quite a few Duncans in Talbot County. He married the granddaughter of Henry Clay McCoy, who was a federal revenuer. They had such a reputation for smuggling on Holland's Island that the federal government sent a resident revenuer to stay on the island. Henry McCoy, he had 4 little daughters, but they all married oystermen on the island. So you can see there were some handsome men out there. Marcellus Matthew Hurley. This on the left is Russell Parks, and his cousin Ernest Kelly. Right about the time of the First World War was when the island had started to disintegrate to such a point that the community just had to dissolve. Russell Parks, he's holding his arm to show that he's got a wound stripe on his sleeve to show that he was wounded in the First World War. So I don't know how they found him and drafted him, because they were all scattering about that time. But he went over and got wounded. This is George Kelly. He almost all the ones that when they left the island, they pretty much all stayed close to the water. But George Kelly, they said, went to Baltimore and became a trolleyman. There's tintypes I just flipped past. I'm not sure. I can't say who they are, but it was Rena Grant Parks that had these in her trunk that they found after she was gone, and so there's no record of who they were, but they were probably in Chrisfield at a photographer's studio posing for these pictures. Methodism was really crucial to the life out there. And this is the 3rd church, because they kept outgrowing their church. And this church was dismantled and taken to Upper Fairmount by an independent congregation. And they abandoned it, and it was a warehouse, and it finally fell apart. But there's a few pews left in the Upper Fairmount Academy. If you ever go down for Academy Day, they had a red men's hall. You can't see the hall behind them, but these gentlemen are lined up in front of the improved order of red men, the fraternal organization. And they even had their convention on Holland Island one day. The school operated from 1867 to 1918 when the last families left. And the first teacher was the preacher did the official school, teaching 12 children in the church building. So they didn't have the separation of church and state in those days, but it grew into they needed 2 teachers and 2 rooms in the school. But they were mostly young girls from South Dorchester that got assigned to Holland Island. A couple of local girls did grow up to be teachers. When the oysters got so valuable, they ended up, this was like a subdivision on this high western bank where it had been sheltered by Long Island. The farm there was subdivided and all these houses sprung up on this high ridge that they said was 30 feet high. And that was what really made it vulnerable, because when Long Island was gone and there was nothing to impede the waves coming from the western shore and on the northwest wind, they kept undercutting the bank. This, let's see, this is William Wiley Park's house. He was married to one of the daughters of the federal revenuer. He married Rosina McCoy, and their house, this was on the Bay Shore Ridge. She wrote that in the later days, they'd be laying in bed on a dark and stormy night, and it would sound like a nearby crack of lightning, but it was really another chunk of the ridge falling into the bay. But before they left, where there had been an orchard between the house and the bay, so when she did her dishes, she'd throw the dishwater out the back and it would land on the beach. So they moved, they moved to Chrisfield, and the house was taken apart and reassembled on Bishop's Head. Jacob Bradshaw, he was the oldest man left on the later days of the island. And he could, at one time, it was his orchard that was between the homes and the bay. He could sit on his porch looking at the orchard, and when he'd hear hammering, it would be one of his neighbors building a boat. If there were numerous boat builders, anybody could knock together a little skiff, I'm sure. So, but in the later days when he heard hammering, it was one of his neighbors taking his house apart. His house went to Bishop's Head. He moved to Cambridge. So this is George Kelly filling his pipe, and Clarence Todd in the middle, and Henry Duncan on the right. They said that generally the Kellys went to Cambridge, the Todds went to Chrisfield, and the Duncans went to Talbot County. So they didn't scatter to the four winds, but they did go in a lot of different directions. But this is Captain Katz Evans. He's from Elliott's Island, but this is the stem of his father-in-law's boat. father-in-law was George Price. He sailed his schooner, the Minnie and Lily, up to Vienna, ran it aground and got a job on the railroad. So I guess he'd seen enough water. This is the prices. We have a price here by marriage. I don't know if it's any relation, but this is Thomas and Edna Price's house. And Miss Edna, she had a dry goods store. And it was one of 9 stores that were operating on the island. So it really was a prosperous place. And I guess it gave the ladies a place to hang out because they bragged about Miss Edna's dry goods store. And the men could hang with the ship chandlers, but they had their own store too. But the Prices had a rich history. They had gone from privateering to having Mr. Ephraim Price, who was considered the father of Methodism in the area. And Thomas Price, he was a trustee of the school. They probably, one of the people here is probably a teacher that roomed with them, who was one of the South Dorchester girls. She graduated from the 7th grade, and then she got her teacher's license, and she taught a couple years, and then she was assigned to Holland Island. She said, I didn't have no high school. She went out, and her father took her in his canoe to Holland Island, and Mr. Price met the boat, and he said, there's some rough youngins on here. If you can't handle that, you better get back in your father's canoe and go back to Bishop's Head. She said after that, she never unpacked the whole time she was there. But she said, I didn't have no switch. I had a paddle. These boys that they would have to go and work on the dredge boats when they had any age at all. So imagine if they were gone from October on in the oyster season, and then they were supposed to come and sit in the classroom and listen to a little snippet of a school marm. It must have been torture. But she took them on. She'd have physical confrontations she described. So this is a typical Holland Island house. This is on Bayview Avenue in Cambridge. This picture is from 1950, and the house on the left is Grant and Ella Park's house, which was the last surviving house that got such an effort to preserve it that came to nothing. But and the trees over there that on the right is his brother Grant, or Jacob Parks, his house that fell quite some time ago. Their father owned the whole northern section of the island. He was probably the most prominent citizen in his time, Captain Bill Arthur. He had farmed a lot of land. It grew vegetables and fruit and raised, ducks and geese. And he had a pair of matched horses that he had. So when he went to church, people waited outside just to see these plumed horses pull up with Captain Bill Arthur. And he divided land for each of his children. And after 1918, when they had to go, some of them kept their houses there, and they would go back in the summer and for the crab season. And that was, all the kids would go, and they had, these idyllic summers spent running barefoot around Holland's Island with all their cousins, and this was the one house where they could stay, and there were several others that families kept, and then they'd all pile in joint family style for the summers. Grant Park's house, and when they stopped going for crab, and they sold this house to a gunning club, and that was the last one that was still standing. And this is Reverend Steve White from Deals Island. His uncle had been a guide for that hunting club, and his wife Diane was descended from islanders. And he had been out there as a youngster with his father and visiting his uncle, and he was, when he came to retirement, he felt this strong attachment to Holland's Island, and they would go over and walk around, and they came on this little family cemetery of the Wilson family, and there was a tombstone for Effie Wilson. She had died at 13 years of age and was buried in this grove, and they read this inscription on her stone, said, "Forget me not is all I ask. I could not ask for more than to be cherished by my friends, so loving and so dear." So he got really inspired to try to save the Parks house and have something to show for all the history after the years had gone by, and he tried and tried to interest the state or environmental groups to take an interest in preserving trace of the island. But and the state actually, they owned Jacob Park's house, but they weren't interested in protecting it, and because their descendants of Jacob Parks had willed it to the state thinking it would be in safe hands, but the state didn't do anything. And the environmentalists, some of them didn't like the Reverend White was doing things that weren't natural, building breakwaters and wrestling things around stone jetties, and some of them didn't like that. So the natural was left to nature. This is around 2010, the pelicans started coming up and nesting, and they were very destructive of all the undergrowth. Beaks were so powerful they could bite off anything growing to build their nests and all. But people, the pictures like this, people think that there was nothing left of it, but there was still, the whole lower part of the island was still there. It's gradually turning into marsh. When I was just about finished and ready to go to the printer with the book, I found out my dentist was going out there as the house was breaking slowly. He would go out there about once a week and motor around and take pictures of things. As here you can see one of the, I think it was just a tropical storm, I don't think it was a hurricane, took that kitchen out of the house. And here it starts, and it's buckling and falling. But this must be looking south because you can see the grove of trees and there's still a good bit of land left. But that all, everything's broken up and washed away. And that's what's left. There's a couple cemeteries on the island and a lot of marsh.
The book is Holland Island, Lost Atlantis of the Chesapeake. Thank you very much, Anne. This was so. Come and see us at the library. Bye-bye.